Hi, welcome to Meet the Surrey Editors. My name is Istusiadia from the School of Hospitality and Tourism Management at the University of Surrey. And joining me today is Professor John Tribe, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Annals of Tourism Research, and Professor Caroline Skulls, who is the Editor of Tourist Studies, and Professor Graham Miller, who is the Editor of Journal of Sustainable Tourism. And we are going to have discussions about publishing in general and also requirements with these journals. So first I would like to invite the editors to introduce their journals, and we're starting with Professor Tribe.
Thank you, Is. Yes, so I am Editor-in-Chief of Annals of Tourism Research. That was founded over 40 years ago by Professor Jafar Jafari. I'm in my 10th year of editing that journal, and as most people know, it's a broad social sciences of tourism journal, and it invites submissions for qualitative and quantitative research.
Thanks. So Tourist Studies started back in 2001. The founding editors were Mike Krang and Adrian Franklin, so a geographer and a sociologist. And then I've just recently taken over from Tim Edensor, who's a geographer, and I co-edit the journal with Gordon Waite, who is at the University of Wollongong in Australia. And Tourist Studies, what we aim to do is address a wide range of social science approaches to understanding tourism, tourist phenomena, etc. within the Tourist Studies range. So really drawing on a whole range of different disciplines, geography, sociology, and we do that from a qualitative perspective at the moment.
And Journal of Sustainable Tourism is in its 25th year. Bernard Lane and Bill Bramwell set up the journal. They've now moved aside, and James Hyam at the University of Otago in New Zealand and myself, we're the co-editors, so we look through all the papers that come through. We have somewhere around 500 papers expected in this year. The remit of the journal, as the name would suggest, is around sustainability. We take the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a broad framework of topics that we're interested in, and it's the reciprocal relationship between sustainability and tourism and sustainability that we take our papers on.
And I think everybody probably are curious about, what is it like being an editor? So could you explain a little bit what's, well, a day in the life of an editor like?
It's incredibly glamorous. Not. In fact, most days a lot of submissions come in. So in a week you'll get a lot of submissions that come in. So by and large it's just dealing with submissions. It's looking at submissions, it's deciding whether they should go out to review or they should be desk rejected. And then it's cleaning up the other end. So on the one hand there's papers coming in and there's papers that have been accepted, so it's sorting out those papers as well. But actually it's a pretty straightforward secretarial job, really, strangely.
It's the sort of unrelenting nature of papers coming in. We're probably up to around 500 papers submitted this year, and we'll publish around 100 of them. So about 20-25% of papers gets through. That's a lot of work which is ultimately fruitless. So in some senses it's a slightly unrewarding task, in that there's a lot of work to end up with a fairly small product at the end. But the papers just keep on coming, essentially sort of a couple a day.
But I think it's the variety of those papers that are coming in. Certainly for a journal like Tourist Studies, we see such a wide range of different submissions. So yes, there is that kind of the relentlessness that comes through, because it does seem that every time you check your emails there's another submission, which is a fantastic thing, because obviously people are wanting to submit to the journals, they're wanting to publish in the journals. But no 2 days really are the same from that perspective in terms of the topics that are crossing your desk. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing to see all the different research that people are involved in.
What types of papers are you looking for?
I'm looking for papers that are on topic would be a great start. Probably the biggest reason we reject papers, desk reject papers, and we run at about 60% desk reject, something like that, is that they're not related to sustainability. And you would think that with sustainability in the title of the journal, that would give a clue. So things that relate to sustainability. That's a broad topic, so I'm interested in papers that are interesting. I know that's not very specific, but the paper has to be interesting with so many coming through. It's got to stand out in some way, and there's too many, I think, identikit papers that come through which are just very mechanical, very sort of iterative methodologically or iterative theoretically, that are really not of any great interest to me or the readers, and those are the ones that are getting kicked out, I'm afraid.
That's a really important point. You know, it's, yes, being on topic, know what the journal is looking for, but it's advancing that knowledge. It's about, you know, developing new ideas, new theories, new empirical understanding of particular conceptual models, frameworks in particular geographical locations, for example, or in particular empirical context. You know, it's looking, as Graham said, it's about making sure that what you're submitting is interesting, that you're aware of the wider body of knowledge that you're contributing to. And if you're aware of that and you know that what your paper holds is in addition to that, then that's going to capture people's attention.
I think the mantra of Annals would be big new tourism idea in a straightforward way. So it's actually very simple, really. But you'd be surprised how many small tourism ideas people are working on, and in a very complicated way.
So what are the most exciting topics that Annals, your journals, have published recently?
I'm very careful how I answer that kind of question, because I think that any paper that's got through to the final hurdle of Annals is likely to be exciting, it's likely to be cutting edge. So I probably wouldn't pick out anything specific. Some of the bigger idea papers are the ones that have been commissioned. So we commission review papers. There's one just about to be published on the political economy of tourism, for example. So they tend to be big, general, have a wide sweep, and they'll be very highly cited, I think.
I think we see more of those, and we're looking to commission more special issues, so you can give a topic much more depth of inquiry. And so those feel a bit more exciting because we can go out and deliberately commission those special issues or those review papers. Otherwise you are just left to wait for things to drop in, and it feels a little bit more purposive to be going out, having identified a topic either, you know, over this summer 2017, if people watching this on reruns, tons of stuff in the news about overcrowding of tourism and overpopulation of tourism, really sort of caught hold as a news story. And so you think, well, we should be doing a special issue on that. That's perfect. That'd be great. The publishing cycles are so slow that we'll be a year behind by the time we get that out. But at least there'll be that academic retort, in a way, to all the stuff that's been on the news. But that's more exciting, I think, where we can see things go to key authors, potentially outside of tourism as well as within tourism, and bring new ideas into the subject in a more purposive way.
But the interesting thing about that is that the news has just caught up with what journals were publishing 10 years ago, isn't it? I mean, I just find that really strange, actually. But, and that, as you say, those topics have really got very hot in the news this year.
And I think something that works certainly within the tourist studies area is looking at conferences and looking at what people are presenting in conferences and actually working with authors, and as Graham said, you know, whether it be through special issues or whether it be, you know, actually commissioning particular pieces. But yeah, I mean, there's no one particular area, because of course if you start identifying key areas, then you will tend to find that you will only get papers necessarily or focusing more on that, and that then doesn't leave space for other things coming through. And certainly something that within tourist studies, even though it's a tourism journal, one thing that we do a lot of is we have a lot of geographers, sociologists, etc. submitting to us as well. So they bring new, different theories, different approaches that we wouldn't necessarily get.
But I think when you look at citations and downloads of papers, the ones that do best are the ones with ideas in them. You know, the empirical papers, the ones that have looked at a phenomenon in a place and here's the result. You know, they're hard to get excited about those. The ones that cite and download the best are the ones that bring in a new idea into the subject area and think about something from a new perspective. So we've had ones on narcissism, the inspiration and awe and things like that coming in that are not really traditionally part of what we've thought about, I think, previously. So those are the ones that make me interested and excited.
Do you see any trends in submission, or do you see that as a the one that you're looking for? Do you see that? Do you see more of that submission, or do you see less of what you're looking for?
Probably both.
I would say it is. It is a bit of both, and like we've said before, you know, you never quite know what your inbox is going to bring you. So if, for example, you know, obviously if you've got a call for a special issue, then of course you're going to get particular focuses coming in. If you just wait and see what comes through, then again, there's the time lag, because things are hitting the news now, but the research hasn't necessarily been done, and so there's a bit of a lag there as well. But it really is sometimes just waiting and seeing what comes through, unless you want to be proactive and go out and make particular requests or make particular contacts out into, whether it be a conference or whether it be
I think the other trend is that there's been a huge rise in submissions, and that's driven by institutions driving their employees to submit to top-tier journals. And in the past, I think I would say that people would be slightly more self-selective about what they might submit to Annals. So people would really think carefully about what they submit to Annals. Now I think people just think, well, I might as well submit there and see what happens.
Let's try, right?
So that would be the sort of slightly negative trend, really, that there's more average papers being submitted. That means there's more that are being desk rejected.
And do you think that's in the style of papers as well? Because if you're being pressed to publish, there's that lends itself to a certain style of paper over another style of paper. The big ideas are hard to come up with any frequencies.
Yeah, the big ideas. People aren't going to publish a big idea paper more than once a year, probably not more than once every 2 years.
So it lends itself towards a much more sort of incremental, quantitative kind of paper. And I think we see more of those than we did previously, and I think that again is a response to REF in this country, and then Australia and other countries, New Zealand having those systems as well now, Hong Kong with those.
So in a sense, that's got everything around the wrong way, in fact. So people are not publishing because they've got something they're really passionate about and want to publish. They're publishing because they're told to publish so many times a year. So it's a shame that that's driving submissions rather than a love and a passion for knowledge, I think.
And you mentioned earlier about rejection rate. So what's your acceptance rate?
Annals has got a 15 to 18% acceptance rate. So everyone knows Annals is a really mean journal. But it's actually not a mean journal, because we assess things by criteria. So if every submission passed those criteria, we would publish everything. So I don't plan to reject 85% of the papers. I've got enough pages to publish anything, but that's the average that comes out.
I think actually we've got a really very small acceptance. I was just looking at it just before we came in, and we actually only accept 5% of the papers that are submitted. Now that's not before anyone starts. That's not because we were mean. Actually, one of the biggest things with tourist studies is, as I said right at the very beginning, we currently only publish qualitative work. And actually the number, and it comes, one of the things that we were hoping to discuss was kind of what should you do when submitting to a journal. The number one thing, as we've mentioned before, is look at what that journal is looking for. The reason, I can tell you now, one of the main reasons why our acceptance rate is so low is because of the number of quantitative papers that we get submitted. So it's not because we, like John, you know, in Annals, if your work is really great and it's really interesting, then of course we're going to publish it, absolutely, or we're going to move it through the publication process. But my plea, if anything, to anyone considering publishing in a journal is make sure that you read the requirements of that journal and then make your submission accordingly. Then my acceptance rate might come up a little bit.
Great. And so this is very important. How do you define rigor and contribution?
I just take that question slightly differently, really, and I'd put that in a broader context. So that's really a question about what we're going to accept, I think, for the journal. And Annals has always had 3 criteria: significance, rigor, and originality. So significant means it has to be a big topic, something that's important. Originality clearly means it's not been written about before. And of course, one of the things I do for every paper that comes in, I look at the cross-check and see and authenticate to see whether parts of that paper have appeared elsewhere. And actually, probably about 5% of papers are desk rejected because they have a very high
Similarities.
high similarity rate. And then rigor is the final criteria. So rigor really means two things, really. Rigor means rigor of method. Okay, so they have to have a clear method. As I say, even conceptual papers have to explain their method.
Right.
Okay, so I have to say that quite a lot to people. And then rigor is also in the way that the work is presented. So a good paper has to be presented in exceptionally good written style. And I think perhaps researchers are a little bit better at their method sometimes, the method side of their rigor, than they are in the structure and the storytelling of the paper. So it's just three simple things in Annals: significance, originality and rigor. Okay, you've got to pass those three tests.
I think that's pretty much the same in terms of those three key areas. The only thing I would add to that is that it's really the clarity of those things. So you can have what could potentially be a very strong piece, but actually the original contribution isn't necessarily clear. The debates and the framing of the conceptual approach, the conceptual framework underpinning the arguments that are carried forward aren't necessarily developed fully enough. But some people have quite and I know people who know me will say, well, that's a bit ironic, but some people have got quite a dense way of writing. So it's about, you know, making sure that again, that clarity coming through in the arguments and having that fluidity through the paper so that you're not jumping from one area to the next, that there's a very clear and constructed narrative and argument going through.
Yeah. I think if there's a comment I make most often on the papers, both those that are accepted and those that are rejected, it's differentiating contribution to theory from contribution to knowledge. And I think perhaps authors not being quite sufficiently aware that just because you've said something that's new for one place doesn't make that a publishable paper. And we need to see that contribution to theory. That means if I'm not interested in that destination, that particular context, I can still take something positive out of the paper, which makes me think about the topic differently than I did before. And I think that too many people fall into that trap of contribution to knowledge, not contribution to theory. The other slight addition would be, in terms of rigor, I feel probably overall qualitative research, perhaps researchers don't feel as much or give as much attention to describing some of the rigor of the methods there that quantitative researchers do. And I think I end up making that comment quite a lot in terms of having qual researchers describe how the methods, how the data were analysed and described, and that, you know, they don't get a free pass on rigor in the same way, unlike quant research. So, yeah, those are probably the two main things.
There's a neat way of describing that. So if you submitted a paper to Annals which proved the law of gravity, that would be very original. Okay. If you submit a paper to Annals that says bananas obey the law of gravity, that would be another case study, as would apples obey the law of gravity. And that's really, I think, what the kind of thing that Graham's saying, that we get a lot of case studies just taking something we know about and taking them to a new destination.
Saying it also
or a new
applies
place.
here.
Right.
Yeah.
What are the common mistakes that authors make?
I would say probably the most common mistake is to submit a little bit prematurely. Okay, so if I look at when I submit to a journal, I'm probably on about version 23, 25 by the time I submit it. So it's gone through a lot of iterations. And I think you really need to, so you shouldn't submit to a journal and say, well, I'll just submit this and see what the referees say, and then I'm going to, you know, I'll improve it. It should be your absolutely best attempt at it, really. So I'd say, you know, you need to put a lot of effort into making sure the piece looks good, it's written good, it's significant, original and rigorous. And it shouldn't have any mistakes in it. So, I mean, really, you know, if there are mistakes in a submitted journal article, then that's pretty serious, really.
Would you see that in other disciplines, this sort of practice of submitting a journal almost for the feedback? And I find that a slightly curious activity, that you would submit something for review, blind external peer review, to get feedback, when you would hope that most people have a network of colleagues that they could get that feedback for in a much more supportive, formative way without taking it through the formal journal submission process. So I would agree, if I see a paper, I want it to be perfect. I don't want to feel like somebody's using me for feedback unofficially.
Yeah.
This is a proper process to go through.
And I think that's particularly important given we've already discussed acceptance rates. Graham, what's your acceptance rate?
I would say we're somewhere around 20%, so
Yeah,
we're
so,
nicer,
yeah,
we're
so-
4 times nicer
so-
than you are.
Well, exactly, yeah. Thanks. But statistically, yeah. but with that, you know, it is that kind of making sure you know what that journal is looking for, making sure that, you know, when you go and you submit, that you've taken that time, because if you have acceptance rates of anywhere between the 20 to the 5, then it is. We know the environment. It's a tough world out there, you know, but it is a supportive world as well. You know, there are lots of, you know, politics one could argue around review processes and everything else, of course, but you shouldn't be submitting expecting to not get to the next point. As John said, you know, if you're going to take the time to develop and build an argument, to develop and build that paper, then it really should be your best work. You should take the time to work out what it is that journal's looking for. Is the journal the right fit? Does it do what, you know, are you writing for the journal, or do you really have a piece of research that you feel is really worth, you know, actually publishing, and then you find the journal that fits. So again, there's different ways of approaching it, but it's always being that respectful of yourself and your research and what you're doing, but respectful of the journal that you're submitting to as well.
There's also another little error that sometimes people write to me and say, "Dear Professor Ryan, I'd like to submit this to your journal," which, in case I know it's already been rejected by Tourism Management.
But people are saying that, you know, the way to find mistakes in your manuscript is when you hit submit.
It's when you what?
You hit submit.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, it's a little bit one pop.
Yeah.
All right, so I have a last question. What do you think about journal ranking and the idea of open access?
What do I think about journal ranking? Oh dear. I'm on the journal ranking committee, so I better say something positive about that. I think journal ranking's sort of inevitable, really, and I think it has its good and its bad points. Graham's a dean of faculty. Graham needs to find out, you know, in a quite a quick way, what is every academic that comes across Graham is going to say, "Oh, I've published really great work," you know. Now, somewhere along the line, you're going to have to make a judgment of whether that is great work or not. Now, and one way, or just one way of getting an angle to that, is to have journals which are ranked. Okay, they're ranked by peers. That is a way of evaluating a work. It is not the only way, though. So I think, you know, journal ranking is useful, but it should be seen just as one of many measures of evaluating work. What was the other question about journal ranking?
Open access.
Open access. I'm, you know, so, you know, if people can run an open access journal, which is highly ranked, good luck to them. You know, I mean, I'm all for that. I'm all for open, open fields. It's very difficult to do that, though. It's very difficult to start a journal from nowhere and get it highly ranked. And of course, you know, open access journals, they have the same basic costs as any other journal, so it's actually very difficult to find a financial model for supporting an open access journal, because it costs a lot of money to publish a journal.
I think it's taking on the editorship, you realise actually how much work there goes on behind the scenes, and the setting up the system, the technical aspects, obviously the copy editing and all of that process, the marketing, has sort of made me appreciate a bit more the work that goes on behind the scenes. And as John says, unless the open access journal is not going to do that, so then you end up with papers that have only been reviewed by peer reviews by yourself, but have not been reviewed by a proper copy editor, they've not been set properly. You end up with a sort of an unprofessional, incomplete journal. Difficult to see how you can really get that to work. The principle of open access, fantastic, but there is a lot of work that goes into it, and somebody has to pay for that. That seems inevitable.
Right. How about open access articles in your journal?
Well, you can get an open access
Yeah.
article in Annals. You just have to pay the cost for it. So I think
Right.
the upfront cost is something like about $3,000, and then it becomes open access. But of course, actually, there's a lot said about open access. For most journals, you can post your last word copy of your article on an institutional repository.
Right.
There's a small blackout period, and then the thing is open access anyway. Okay, so people make a lot of fuss about open access, but actually, if you're smart, you can
Yeah,
find a
pretty
way
much
of
it,
getting
yeah.
open access
And-
anyway.
And also getting, even if we try to get in papers out to industry, so we've got a Twitter account and the marketing that goes around it. But if somebody in industry wants the paper, it costs them $29, $30, whatever it is to download it. And so for most people in practice, if this really is a useful paper for you, $30 is not prohibitive to be able to read it.
All right. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Isa.
You're more than
Thank you,
welcome,
Reece.
Reece. Thank you
Very
very
well done.
much. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.